I hope you can see my source sheet. So I will repeat that I view Maimonides as one of the most important Jews of all time, the most significant in terms of the Jewish tradition, Jewish thought. But he provoked a lot of controversy both in his lifetime and afterwards. And today we have a lot of sources to get through, so I'm going to start that promptly. But just as an introductory matter, I'll note that we will be looking at issues and texts today that really go to the core of the agenda of reform that he sought to achieve in his lifetime. He was trying to refine and purify Judaism of certain elements that he thought were not sort of integral to the essence of the religion, in fact, corrupted the essence of the religion. So he tried to reform the Judaism of his day, but as I've said in past sessions, he was largely unsuccessful in that endeavor. In some respects, Judaism today is Maimonidean in terms of following the trajectory of Maimonides' thought, but in many other ways it is not. And his fairly radical agenda of religious reform ultimately was unsuccessful in overcoming some of the motifs and patterns of thought that he sought to overcome. For that, let me see if I can. Okay, so this is the third class session. I'm going to start by really jumping into the issues that Maimonides was trying to overcome. So the nature of his reform agenda was such that he was trying to rid Judaism of elements that he thought were idolatrous. He was trying to return Jews to what he thought was the original conception of God, which was very sort of simply, straightforwardly, uncomplicatedly monotheistic. And he thought there were elements of Judaism that had emerged that really tainted that pristine view of God. This is a text, the first one from Moshe Idel, a book that he wrote several decades ago. Moshe Idel is perhaps the leading scholar in the world of Kabbalah at Hebrew University. He was a student, among other people, of Gershom Sholom's work, and really has taken over from Gershom Sholom as the leading scholar of Kabbalah. And this is a sort of summary of the historical interplay of Maimonides' thought and proto-Kabbalah. Kabbalah emerged a little bit after Maimonides' lifetime. Moshe Idel writes, the emergence of major Kabbalistic schools did not stir significant controversies in the Jewish milieus in which they arose. The paucity of criticism is surprising when compared to a parallel phenomenon, close both in time and location to the rise of Kabbalah, the attitude towards Maimonides' philosophy. Prima facie, there is something surprising in this controversy, meaning about Maimonides' work. It was directed against a personality, Maimonides, who combined an outstanding mastery of halakha, of Jewish law, and as a philosopher, a precise, careful manner of writing intended to avoid the very situation in which he and his thought became involved, religious controversy. The fact that such a controversy nevertheless erupted demonstrates that Maimonides' thought appeared amid delicate circumstances in which any kind of innovation, even a prudently formulated one like Maimonides', was subject to careful examination and eventually to sharp criticism. The crucial question, Idel continues, in this context is why Kabbalah emerged at the same time and locale as the Maimonidean controversy. Kabbalah emerged in the late 12th and early 13th centuries as a sort of reaction to the dismissal of earlier mystical traditions by Maimonides' audacious reinterpretation of Jewish esotericism and his attempt to replace the mythical traditions with a philosophical understanding. Kabbalah can be viewed as part of a restructuring of those aspects of rabbinic thought that were denied authenticity by Maimonides' system. So Idel is really highlighting this very interesting historical interplay. On the one hand, Maimonides was trying to rid Judaism of these proto-Kabbalistic um, motifs and patterns of thought. But Maimonides' very aggressive attempt to root out those patterns of thought from Judaism, that effort by Maimonides itself gave rise to the surfacing in Judaism of Kabbalistic ideas. The Kabbalah really, Idel argues, really developed in response to Maimonides trying to suppress and supplant the sort of mystical trends in Judaism that Kabbalah came to embody. So it's a very interesting historical interplay between Maimonides' thought on the one hand and the growth and development of Kabbalah on the other. To put it very simply, Maimonides was trying to suppress mystical and Kabbalistic ideas, but by doing so aggressively, he actually gave rise to the growth and development of Kabbalah in reaction to Maimonides' philosophical work. So here's an example of one of the issues in which this interplay is really embodied, the sort of struggle between Maimonides' philosophical perspective on the one hand and the mystical proto-Kabbalistic ideas that he was trying to suppress on the other. This first text is from a book called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer from about the 8th century. I'll note that this book, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, became really sort of a principal rabbinic source of the Zohar, perhaps the most famous Kabbalistic work centuries later. And this issue goes to the sort of very core issue. Does our Torah that we have in our hands actually predate the creation of the world? This text reads, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus said, 7 things were created before the creation of the world. So when you open the book of Genesis and it talks about the creation of the world, these 7 things actually were created by God in advance of what we read at the beginning of Genesis. They are the Torah, Gehinnom in the Hebrew, the Garden of Eden, God's throne of glory, the temple that stood in Jerusalem, repentance, and the name of the Messiah. And I'll just note, I think some of these things were included in the list to give a sense that concepts of good and evil predate the creation. So they're part of nature, a part of objective reality itself. And one of those things is the Torah itself. So the Torah is really a part of the fabric of the universe, predating the creation of the world. It was part of a sort of pre-creation process. And this gave rise to mystical ideas that the Torah was used by God as a blueprint for the creation of the world that we read about in Genesis. In fact, this text says, so promptly after creating these 7 things, the Holy One, blessed be He, consulted with the Torah, whose name is Tushia, which means wisdom or resourcefulness regarding the creation of the world. So there's a pretty novel understanding of the Torah as actually a consultant to God in the creation of the world that we read about in Genesis. But the Torah is primordial. It's eternal, essentially, and it functioned as a blueprint for the rest of creation. And by the way, that a byproduct of that is every word of the Torah is sort of written into the essence of our reality. That notions of good and evil are not socially determined. They're eternal. They were determined even before the creation of the world. Well, Maimonides does not like that idea. As I've noted in prior sessions, Maimonides placed great weight on the discovery by Abraham of monotheism. I noted in the last session that really, according to Maimonides, everything in our Torah could have been different, depending on if history had gone a little differently. And Maimonides does not like the idea that there is anything eternal in the universe other than God. He writes in the Guide of the Perplexed, his great philosophical masterpiece, for the purpose of every follower of the law of Moses and Abraham our father is to believe that there is nothing eternal in any way at all existing simultaneously with God. So he utterly rejects this notion that the Torah and any of these other six items were created before our world was created. The Torah is not eternal for Maimonides. It is um, contingent, in fact, on historical circumstances. I've mentioned that. We'll get back to that in the final session. But for Maimonides, what was at risk in this idea that these various items were created before our world was created is God's very uniqueness, God's very unity is at risk if we think, well, these other things are also eternal. That makes God essentially less of one of a kind, that these various things, in addition to God, are eternal. Maimonides, being the absolute strict monotheist that he was, wanted to uphold, embrace, and advocate for the strict uniqueness and unity of God as different from everything else in our universe, including our Torah. And this idea that the Torah predates creation became an important element of Kabbalistic thought of the kind that Maimonides was trying to suppress and root out, but really was unsuccessful in doing. We're going to turn now to what's going to be really the dominant topic of our conversation this evening, which is the incorporeality of God, meaning God has no physical form or image, according to Maimonides, and the controversy of biblical allegory, which is the way that Maimonides was forced to read a lot of the anthropomorphic descriptions of God in our Torah. Again, from Moshe Idel, I'm trying to establish this contrast between Maimonides' philosophically strict monotheism and the elements of proto-Kabbalah and full-fledged Kabbalah that emerged in reaction to his strict philosophical perspective. Idel writes, the mainstream of Kabbalistic thought undoubtedly is the Theosophical Kabbalah, which is, I'll just note, is focused on sort of wisdom about the essence of God, whose dominant conception is that of a complex and dynamic structure of divine powers commonly known as Sfirot. This term first occurring in Sefer Yetzirah, which is an ancient book. We're not sure exactly when it should be dated, but it embodies various ancient Jewish mystical theories. So the term Sfirot has been interpreted since the late 12th century as designating manifestations that are either part of the divine structure or directly related to the divine essence, serving as its vessels or instruments. Almost universally, these powers number 10. Classical Kabbalistic theosophy includes both an elaborate anthropomorphical hierarchy and dynamic interrelationships among the components of this hierarchy. So Idel, I'm including this quote so you have a sense of what was at issue in the Kabbalistic thought that was emerging at about the same time as Maimonides, that he was trying to suppress and remove from what he thought was pristine and pure Judaism. The idea that really animated the growth and development of Kabbalah was an entire project of trying to sort of map out what I'll call sort of the infrastructure of the Godhead, the divine realm. And if you recall, we had a speaker last year at Or Zarua who was Professor Yossi Chayes, who's written an important book about medieval Kabbalistic diagrams in the form of trees. Kabbalists over time came to plot out, literally diagram, the sort of nature of the divine realm in ways that Maimonides almost surely would have rejected as, frankly, as idolatrous and heretical. So turning to Maimonides' own strict and very sort of almost simplistic but straightforward and quite rigid sense of monotheism, Maimonides issued 13 principles of faith. I mentioned them in a prior session. I'm not going to focus on most of them. I will note that it's really only the first 4 or so that go to beliefs, dogmatic beliefs about the nature of God, that Maimonides would really continue to be very adamant about. The rest of them, including whether the world was even created or whether it's eternal, is one that other principles of faith that he issued early in his career, I think he over time he probably thought were dispensable. But this one, the third principle of faith about the incorporeality of God, that God has no physical image or form, was one that throughout his writings over the course of his entire lifetime, he was very adamant that Jews had to adhere to. He writes in the Mishnah Torah, his great code of Jewish law, right near the beginning of the work. So I've mentioned one might think that a code of law would not include philosophical principles, but for Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, the beginning of his great code of Jewish law includes various principles of intellectual understanding of God that we need to keep in mind as we practice, as we fulfill the commandments. So as Maimonides goes on to describe practical Judaism, he starts out as a threshold matter with philosophical truths. And he writes in the Mishnah Torah, since it has been clarified that God does not have a body or corporeal form, it is also clear that none of the functions of the body are appropriate to God. Neither connection nor separation, neither place nor measure, neither ascent nor descent, neither right nor left, neither front nor back, neither standing nor sitting. So I won't read it all, but anything that we think of anthropomorphically as related to God, Maimonides is telling us, dispel yourself, dispel your understanding of those conceptions of God. God is nothing like us. And he writes, since this is so, all such anthropomorphic descriptions of God and the like that are related in the Torah and the words of the prophets, all these physical descriptions are metaphors and imagery. So we'll get to this in just a moment, but the Torah is chock full of anthropomorphic descriptions of God, and Maimonides' rigid monotheism mandated that whenever we come across anthropomorphic descriptions of God, they have to be read figuratively, metaphorically, and allegorically, and not literally. Maimonides writes right before that, the passage I just read, a prerequisite or a sort of a foundational view of God's incorporeality, that God has no body or form, is that God is utterly unique in the universe and unified in God's essence. There are no components of God. So Maimonides writes, this God is one, meaning our God. God is not two or more, but one, unified in a manner which surpasses any unity that is found in the world. That is, God is not one in the matter of a general category, which includes many individual entities, nor one in the way that the body is divided into different portions and dimensions. Rather, God is unified, and there exists no unity similar to God's in this world. I won't read it all, but at the end he says, the knowledge of this concept fulfills a positive commandment, and this is from the Shema, right? The Hebrew Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord is our God. God is one, or we need to worship God alone, depending on how you translate the last word Echad there. For Maimonides, that embodies our religious imperative, our religious obligation to understand as best we can that God is one, God is unique, God is eternal, and that God absolutely has never assumed any physical form. Maimonides continues, as part of this sort of regimen of strict monotheism, he describes a curriculum. How should we teach our children? What do we need to teach our Jewish children so that they can become proper and correctly believing Jews? Maimonides writes in the Guide of the Perplexed, children should be made to accept the belief that the difference between God and them is not merely a difference of more or less, but one concerning the species of existence. The negation of the doctrine of the corporeality of God and the denial of God having a likeness to created things and of his being subject to affections are matters that ought to be made clear and explained to everyone according to his capacity, and ought to be inculcated in virtue of traditional authority upon children, women, stupid ones, and those of a defective natural disposition. I'll stop there, but again, Maimonides was an elitist, and he thought the masses had to be trained properly because the assumption is most Jews did not have the capacity to reach true and correct and proper understandings of God. So the Jewish masses had to be trained to reach an understanding of God that comported with their capacities, but that left behind as much as possible idolatrous notions of God's essence, of God having any physical form. The next This next short text is from Professor Marc Shapiro, who was our speaker at the Scholarly Shabbaton a year ago at Or Zarua, from his important book about Maimonides' 13 Principles. Professor Shapiro writes there, it should be obvious to all that Maimonides' insistence on God's incorporeality contradicts a simple reading of the Bible. In the Bible, God is frequently described as a physical being with a back, a head, a hand. Indeed, nowhere in the Bible does it state that God is incorporeal or invisible, for that matter, Professor Shapiro notes. So Maimonides was trying to advance a very strict, pristine notion of monotheism, that God is absolutely, utterly unlike human beings. We should not even imagine that God shares anything in common with us. But that Maimonidean philosophy really runs up against the plain meanings of many biblical verses that are very anthropomorphic in nature. So I've included some of the most prominent ones. Again, you open the Torah, every book of the Torah has some anthropomorphic descriptions of God in them that Maimonides would have to sort of explain away to advance his agenda of monotheism. You open the book of Genesis and it says very famously, and God created humankind, or perhaps Adam, in his image, creating him or it in the image of God, male and female. He created them. So B'Tselem Elohim bara oto. So this idea that God created people in God's image led many Jews to believe that God must have physical form. We have a form, we have physical image, and so if we're created in the divine image, in the image of God, then God too must have physical form. So right away, when you open the book of Genesis, there's anthropomorphic description of God that troubled Maimonides greatly. The next text here is from Genesis Rabbah, which is a rabbinic commentary from during the Talmudic period on the book of Genesis, which is really fascinating. It says in this text, Rabbi Hoshaya said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, when God created Adam, the ministering angels mistook Adam for God, meaning because Adam was created in the image of God, he looked like God, and wished to exclaim, holy before Adam. To what is this analogous? A king and a governor who sat in a chariot, and his subjects wished to say to the king, sovereign, but they did not know which man it was because they looked alike. What did the king do? He pushed the governor out of the chariot, and so the subjects thereby knew who was the king. Similarly, when the Lord created Adam, the angels mistook him for God. What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do? He caused sleep to fall upon Adam, and so all knew that Adam was but mortal man. Well, this rabbinic passage seems certainly to presume that initially Adam and God shared physical characteristics, that Adam was created in the divine image, and that thereby caused confusion for the angels. And God had to figure out a way to allow the angels to differentiate between the newly created Adam, the human being, and God. But the assumption in this rabbinic text is quite striking, that God and Adam shared physical characteristics. Again, that view, that perspective is one that Maimonides would try to uproot through his philosophical perspective. Here's another anthropomorphic. Actually, this is anthropomorphic, means that God is ascribed physical form. Anthropopathic means that God is ascribed human emotions or feelings. This is, I think, one of the most poignant verses in the Torah, right before the portion, the story of Noah and the flood. in the early part of Genesis, it says, "And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth because man was so evil, and God's heart was saddened." So it's a very anthropopathic description of God, that God has human feelings in a way that we can very much relate to. God had created something, it really had gone awry, and God actually experienced an emotion of regret, that he had his creation was not what he had expected and anticipated. Again, that's a description of God of the kind that Maimonides would not favor. Other examples, and I've chosen some of the most famous from Exodus. "And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst." So we celebrated Pesach recently. This is leading up to the story of the Exodus, and it says in the Hebrew, "Bin toti et yadi al Mitzrayim," when I stretch out my hand. Now, to the extent that we as modern readers view any of these anthropomorphic descriptions as figurative, or sort of allegorical or metaphorical in nature, that's really only because Maimonides pressed his agenda so forcefully, and to that extent he was successful in doing so. But this is, when I prepared for the class, I was surprised to find that even Rashi, the most famous biblical Jewish commentator who predated Maimonides by about a century, Rashi on this verse, on Exodus, really surprisingly to me, says on this Hebrew word et yadi, stretch out my hand, says yad mamash, which means an actual or a literal hand, to lehakot by him, to smite the Egyptians. So Rashi seemed to be, based on this and other pieces of evidence in his commentary, both on the Torah and the Talmud, Rashi seems to have been a corporealist, meaning he seemed to believe that God actually had physical form, and he's going out of his way to note we shouldn't think of it just figuratively, that God's power was demonstrated. That's what God's hand means. It really means God's power, sort of figuratively. No, Rashi is saying actually there was almost like a superhero hand that God stretched out to smite the Egyptians, which is a very striking way to view the difference between Rashi on the one hand and Maimonides on the other. Another verse from Deuteronomy, again, this is straight from the Passover story. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, etc. Those are very anthropomorphic motifs in the Exodus story. And then turning to the revelation of the Torah, in later on in Exodus, it says the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So this idea that God actually descended upon Mount Sinai and occupied a physical space there, at which or in which Moses then encountered God, is a very anthropomorphic way of seeing the revelation at Mount Sinai episode. Again, in a way that we'll see Maimonides highly disfavored. This is the first verse from the book of Leviticus. We take it for granted, but I don't know how many times Leviticus sort of endlessly uses the phrase Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, that God spoke to Moses, saying. Here, the first verse says, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. Well, so the prior passages indicated that God had physical form. These dozens and dozens of verses in Leviticus seem to indicate that God also has the capacity of speech, of human speech somehow, or at least some way to communicate to a human being in a way that sounds very anthropomorphic. Here are a couple of passages that describe the divine presence in the Torah. There are different words used, the God's kavod. You see this italicized word here, ba'avor kavodi, or the word shechina, the divine presence. In Exodus 33, verse 20, But God said, "You cannot see my face." He's talking to Moses. "For man may not see me and live." And the Lord said to Moses, "See, there is a place near me. Station yourself in the rock, and as my presence, v'haya ba'avor kavodi, as my kavod passes by, I will put you, Moses, in a cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." Remember, just a few moments ago, I read Professor Shapiro's note in his book that the Torah seems to indicate that God has a hand, has a back, has a face. These passages about God's presence, God's kavod, are extremely problematic for Maimonides. Here's another one. When Moses finished the work, this is about completing the tabernacle, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord, uchvod Adonai, filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence, the kavod of the Lord, filled the tabernacle. So, not only is the kavod, the some sort of presence or glory of God, not only is it sort of tangible and material or visible, but it is also, in this passage, sort of impenetrable, that we can see it, and you can see that you can't enter the tabernacle when the kavod is occupying the space. Again, a very anthropomorphically physical conception of God's essence. Another passage from Exodus. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended, and they saw the God of Israel under his feet. So now God has feet. There was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Yet God did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. A very sort of strange episode, but which the episode seemingly indicates that the 70 elders, might also include Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, but at least the 70 elders somehow apprehended God's presence, saw God, and there seems to be some unhappiness on God's part about this. It says God did not raise his hand against those leaders of the Israelites, but allowed them to continue. Well, this very anthropomorphic conception of God and a human capacity to experience God physically was highly troubling and problematic to Maimonides, and he needed to explain this episode away. In the Guide of the Perplexed, he writes, "For these words are solely intended to present a criticism of the leader's act of seeing God, not to describe the manner of their seeing. Thus they were solely blamed for the form that their apprehension took, inasmuch as corporeality entered into it to some extent," meaning in their apprehension of God, they should not have seen God as any physical or experienced God in any physical form. And Maimonides is saying because they rushed into it, they weren't prepared for their experience, they didn't understand intellectually how to approach God properly. That's why God was upset in how they conceived of him. This being necessitated by their over hasty rushing forward before they had reached perfection. They deserved to perish. However, Moses interceded on their behalf, and they were granted a reprieve. It was only provisional because later on, actually, those Israelite leaders were killed for other reasons. But Maimonides writes, this having happened to these men, meaning this ill-prepared encounter with the divine presence, through which they apprehended God physically, anthropomorphically, in ways that they should not have. That was an incorrect apprehension of God. Maimonides writes, it behooves us all the more as being inferior to those Israelite leaders, and it behooves those who are inferior to us, meaning the more philosophically sophisticated, to aim at and engage in perfecting our knowledge in preparatory matters and in achieving those premises that purify apprehension of its taint, which is error. So for Maimonides, the whole project was to try to properly educate Jews in reaching certain intellectual convictions about God's essence, which were totally God's sort of essence should be totally pure of any physical conception by us, because God was utterly is utterly different in kind from anything we can possibly imagine as human beings. I'll end the passages by noting that we continue this anthropomorphic um, depiction of God, which is quite anti-Maimonidean, even to this day. In the as we carry out various rituals, including the fourth blessing of the Sheva Brachot that we say under the wedding canopy. It's the fourth blessing says, "Blessed are you, God, who created humanity in His image, in the image of the likeness of His form." Asher yatzar et ha'adam betzalmo betzelem demut tavnito, which definitely sounds like God has some sort of physical form and made for them an everlasting establishment, etc., etc. But so even today, every traditional Jewish wedding ceremony includes this very anthropomorphic conception of God and our likeness to that physical form. And Maimonides tried to dispel Judaism um, of those of that literal anthropomorphism. It's there in the Torah, but Maimonides had to devise a way to interpret and explain away the numerous anthropomorphic depictions of God in our Tanakh, in our Torah. So let me get to that. What was Maimonides' sort of strategy in removing the anthropomorphism, removing the corporeality, the physical nature of our conception of God? In the Guide to the Perplexed, right at the beginning, he writes, "The parable in itself is worth nothing, but by means of it you can understand the words of the Torah." So he's getting to his point is, anywhere that we see anthropomorphic descriptions of God, we cannot understand those words literally. We have to understand them by necessity. We have to understand them allegorically or metaphorically or figuratively. And he continues a little bit later in the Guide to the Perplexed. You know the Talmudic rabbi's dictum that refers in inclusive fashion to all the kinds of interpretation connected with this subject, namely they're saying, this is a famous saying in Hebrew, Dibrat Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the human language. That's a rabbinic phrase that really in its original context meant that sort of repetitive phrases or repetitive letters in the Torah should be read sort of colloquially, that not every little repetition should be ascribed meaning. This famously goes to the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael about how the Torah should be interpreted. If you recall, Rabbi Akiva assigned meaning, significance to every slight nuance in the Torah, and this motto of Rabbi Ishmael is saying, no, the Torah speaks in human language. Don't ascribe any particular meaning to every repetition. Maimonides expands that notion and says the meaning of this phrase goes beyond what I just described, is that everything that all men are capable of understanding and representing to themselves at first thought has been ascribed to God as necessarily belonging to God. So here Maimonides is getting to, okay, we should not think of God anthropomorphically. So why does the Torah use anthropomorphic language? And Maimonides, the Rambam, writes that the Torah uses language that is accessible to the Jewish masses, particularly at that historical time, that Jews, the Israelites at that time, needed anthropomorphic language in order to relate to God at all, and to start the sort of journey to a more refined understanding. Hence, attributes indicating God's corporeality have been predicated of God in order to indicate that He may be exalted exists, inasmuch as the multitude cannot at first conceive of any existence save that of a body alone. Thus, that which is neither a body nor existent in a body does not exist in their opinion. So Maimonides is saying the Torah uses anthropomorphic language because the Israelites in the desert, in the wilderness, would not have understood what Moses was talking about if Moses used language that was overly abstract and metaphorical. So the anthropomorphic language was almost purposefully misleading because it represented an initial step in the Israelites' education. So it was necessarily misleading because the Jewish masses of the time could not have really digested the type of philosophical perspective that Maimonides was in the Guide to the Perplexed trying to circulate. He writes in the Guide to the Perplexed in part 2 that the deity is not a body, meaning that God has no physical form, has been demonstrated. From this, it follows necessarily that everything that in its external meaning in the Torah, he means any biblical passages that disagree with this demonstrable truth that God has no body, must be interpreted figuratively, for it is known that such texts are of necessity fit for figurative interpretation. So this very important passage in the guide is saying, Maimonides is teaching us, wherever we see anthropomorphic language, such language has to be understood and interpreted allegorically, metaphorically, because it is such literal anthropomorphism is simply incompatible, irreconcilable with what we know to be philosophic and scientific and logical truth about God. Elsewhere in the Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides writes, if you should say that the external sense of the biblical text causes people to fall into this doubt regarding whether God has physical form, you ought to know that an idolater is similarly impelled to his idolatry by imaginings and defective representations. Accordingly, there is no excuse for one who does not accept the authority of men who inquire into this matter, into this truth, and are engaged in speculation, if he himself, if the reader is incapable of engaging in such speculation directly. I do not consider as an infidel, meaning someone who's a Jewish heretic who is not deserving of a share in the Olam Haba, the world to come. I do not consider as an infidel one who cannot demonstrate, meaning as a scientific matter, that God's corporeality should be negated. But I do consider as an infidel, meaning as a heretic who does not deserve or is not entitled to any share of the world to come, one who does not believe in its negation. So Maimonides is saying very straightforwardly, as a Jew, you must believe that God has no physical form, that God has no corporeal image, because, and any conception of God in physical form is considered heretical. You will forfeit your share in the world to come. So even if you were not a particularly sophisticated Jew, you should accept the authority of people like Maimonides, who have looked into the matter and accept their opinion, their view, which is demonstrably true according to Maimonides, that that God has no form. And unfortunately, Maimonides believed that if you were ignorant of the truth, let's say you were born on a desert island and you didn't know, you had no access to Torah, you had no access to Maimonides' teaching. From Maimonides, that was unfortunately not a good excuse. Even sort of, simple ignoramuses who had no access to higher truth could not share in the world to come if they had a corrupt, incorrect conception of God. Well, that rigid sense of which kinds of Jews were entitled to a share in the world to come. So Maimonides' rigid view was not sort of charitably accepted by many of the rabbinic figures of his time, and certainly later rabbinic figures thought that was much too harsh a verdict for sort of simple Jews. Rabbi Abraham ben David, the Ravid, who was really a peer, a contemporary of Maimonides. He was a great Talmudist, but he's considered one of the sort of forefathers of medieval Kabbalah. So he was mystically inclined, which makes it unsurprising that he would be a critic of Maimonides. Very famously, the Ravid wrote, why has Maimonides called such a person who believes in that God has a body? Why is he called such a person a heretic? There are many people greater and superior to Maimonides who adhere to such a belief based on what they have seen in verses of the Torah, and even more in the words of those rabbinic stories that corrupt right opinion about religious matters. So to be clear, the Raibed here is not saying it is correct to view God as having corporeal physical form. But if you have that belief, because you open the Torah and there are dozens of passages that seem to indicate that God is very similar to human beings in having physical form, in speaking, in occupying space, in having emotions, etc. If you have that incorrect belief, that even the Ravid, acknowledges that's corrupt opinion, but if you have it, you're not a heretic. So to Maimonides, you are a heretic. You forfeited a share in the world to come. And the Ravid is offended by that notion that simple Jews, simple pious Jews who fulfilled all the commandments, but simply had incorrect, unrefined theological conceptions of God, that they should be deemed heretics, was offensive to many rabbinic figures. Here's one centuries later, Rabbi Joseph Ashkenazi, who was very opposed to sort of the type of philosophical endeavors that Maimonides and his later followers were engaged in. He actually turns the tables on Maimonides and accuses Maimonides of heresy, in advancing this notion that God has no form. Rabbi Ashkenazi writes, Maimonides wrote in the book of knowledge, Sefer Hamadah, which is the opening volume of the Mishnah Torah, that anyone who says that God has a form, is physical form, is a heretic. According to this, it is certainly the case that the Torah and the believer of its words are also to be regarded as heretics or heretical, because, and then he quotes various passages that seem to indicate that God has a form. Again, you open up the pages of the Torah, and it's hard to avoid the impression that God has a physical nature to him. They, Maimonidean followers, say that God is intellect, so pure intellect, and does not change. And Maimonides believe that God does not change. And with this, they deny God seeing and hearing things and his speaking. For all these, and even more so God's descent on Mount Sinai, that I referred to earlier in the Torah, and ascent to the heavens, all of those things about God actually require corporeality. For example, notions of God paying attention to our prayers, God rewarding us and punishing us for our behavior. All of those things mandate that God does in fact change, which would flout the Maimonidean view that God is utterly unique, has absolutely nothing in common with us, and of course has no physical form. Rabbi Ashkenazi, and there were a few others like him, believed, no, not only is it not heretical to believe that God has form, but it is perfectly acceptable, because the Torah tells us that God has form. Okay, turning to what I've referred to as the Maimonidean controversies, I've tried to focus in this last portion of this of my presentation on the issue of biblical interpretation as relating to the anthropomorphism in the Torah, the issue of God's corporeality, whether God has a body or not. Again, Maimonides said, no, absolutely, God does not, and we have to interpret all such verses metaphorically and allegorically. Well, that Maimonides perspective was taken perhaps further than even Maimonides may have wanted by his philosophical followers in the century that followed. And this guy here, Abba Mari ben Moses, was sort of an instigator of the excommunication ban that was issued against what they viewed as heretical Maimonidean allegories. He wrote, I became enraged with zeal for the Lord God of Israel when I saw a man of the holy seed, meaning Jews, defiling themselves with the food of the Gentiles, destroying the narrative of the Torah with allegory, while the Torah had no one to inquire and save her. They, meaning that these philosophical allegorists, have nearly stripped the Torah of all its pshat, all the plain meanings, and displayed her naked. So a very, forceful pushback against the Maimonidean allegorical reading of the Torah that seemed to displace the pshat, the plain meaning of the Torah. By the way, Maimonides would argue, no, he was uncovering the plain meaning. So, in fact, the allegorical, the metaphorical sense of the Torah is really what the Torah wanted us to uncover. That is the pshat, the contextual meaning, even if it's not the literal meaning. Um, but the opponents of that sort of reading of the Torah said you're stripping the Torah of its obvious meanings. And in this public letter of condemnation by the Rashba, I started the first class session by reading the text of the ban by the Rashba was the greatest Talmudic authority about a century after Maimonides' life, um, who was himself mystically inclined. So he was sort of inclined to be an opponent of Maimonides. But he sort of got himself embroiled in this local dispute in Montpellier in the southern region of France. And this public letter of condemnation of Maimonidean allegorical thinking was read in the synagogue on Erev Rosh Hashanah 1304 in very, very strident language. Some of them, let me make this a little bit bigger, some of them, meaning some of the Maimonidean philosophical allegorists, have left no scriptural verse undisrupted, saying that it contains some type of allegory. They made Abraham and Sarah figurae for Aristotelian form and matter. We don't need to worry about the details there. They uprooted all the interpretive boundaries in order to interpret the 12 tribes of Jacob as signifiers of the 12 constellations of the zodiac, Amalek as a signifier of the evil inclination, Lot as a signifier of intellect, his wife, who turned into the pillar of salt, as a signifier of matter. So they're saying these Maimonidean followers who are reading the Bible, the Torah, allegorically, were really effacing, were really obscuring and uprooting all of the historical figures of the Torah as if they were not really historical figures anymore. They were just sort of embodiments of abstract truths. So, as if Abraham and Sarah really didn't exist in history, but were just stand ins for some Aristotelian concepts. That's the accusation against the Maimonidean followers. Let the spirits of these people be snuffed out, and may a fire that never dies consume them. May their forms flit about in Sheol, so in the underworld, for the merit of the patriarchs is insufficient to redeem them. They're saying they're even worse than Christians and Muslims who sort of blaspheme about things in the Torah. They falsify the whole Torah, and he is considered wise who plots to discover an antinomian interpretation of a commandment. So this accusation goes even a step beyond. It's saying Maimonidean followers are interpreting the Torah allegorically and thereby stripping the commandments in the Torah themselves of their obligatory nature, because supposedly the commandments really represent more abstract truths. Now, this accusation probably had no basis in fact. Maimonides himself certainly was not antinomian. He was not anti Jewish law. His great code of Jewish law reflects that. And it's almost certainly the case that his followers a century later were also themselves not opposed to fulfilling the commandments. But the accusation against them was that they allegorize even in writing as one who burrows under the law. Their intention is clearly recognizable to say that the commandments are not to be taken literally. Now, Jews accused, of course, Christians of allegorically interpreting the Torah such that the commandments, the obligatory nature of the commandments was lost, that the commandments lost their obligatory nature through the Christian allegorical readings of the Torah, that's why Christians were not themselves obliged anymore to follow the commandments, because they were meant, according to Christianity, those commandments were meant to be understood allegorically. The same accusation is made against Maimonidean followers, that their intention was to uproot traditional Judaism, in effect. And again, that's probably going too far. The Maimonidean followers did engage in biblical allegory, but their intention was very likely not to uproot the commandments. They themselves were were fully observant Jews. They just believed that one needed to read the Torah allegorically in order to reach certain philosophical truths about God. The Rashba, in a private communication to a local figure in the Montpellier community, to encourage him, this local figure, to lead a local effort against the study of philosophy. And by the way, um, at about this same time, the Rashba, again, a great rabbinic authority of his time in Spain, issued an edict that Jews should not study philosophy before the age of 25. But he writes to this guy, on the day that you abandoned Torah to study mathematics, your your intentions were good, but your soul in those days walked as if among the creatures. And he goes on to use imagery about allegory sort of eating up, consuming the Torah. It's sort of a chilling way to frame it. And he says, are the pious of Israel who have not studied philosophy worthy of immortality? And it's a rhetorical question, because for the Rashba, again, who was mystically inclined, the answer is, of course, people who have not studied philosophy, but are pious in all other respects in terms of following Jewish law, of course they are entitled to a share in the world to come, which is effectively immortality. And he says this is where he sort of reveals his mystical hand, his Kabbalistic inclination. Do you not know the famous scholars of Narbonne, a city in nearby in southern France, which was considered a birthplace of medieval Kabbalah, whose work was the hidden meaning of Torah, that is Kabbalah. So for the mystics, the esoteric meaning of the Torah that they uncovered were all the sort of Kabbalistic insights about God's essence, on the one hand. For Maimonides, on the other, they were philosophical truths about God's uniqueness, about God's incorporeality, about God's eternality. So the Rashba is saying, don't you know that these Kabbalists, near you in the southern area of France, of course, they were uncovering the actual mystical secrets of Judaism, unlike Maimonides. Do they and other great non-philosophical scholars travel like slaves upon the earth, while you, the philosophers, stand at the top of the ladder to heaven? Truly, one who thinks like this ought to be cursed with every form of curse. So it's ironic, because that last sentence is not a particularly good recruiting tool. The Rashba was trying to encourage this guy to join in this effort against the study of philosophy, but this local guy was himself philosophically inclined, and the Rashba is saying, if you think like these Maimonidean followers in terms of philosophical allegory, you ought to be cursed. I'm going to end this section with giving the last word to Maimonides. So again, Maimonides' whole project was trying to integrate Torah, traditional Judaism, on the one hand, with philosophical reason, logic, and science on the other. That was his overall project. And in a letter to the Jews of Marseille, in which they asked him, is it okay for Jews to believe in astrology? Maimonides famously and vigorously opposed any resort to belief or practice in astrology. And in the concluding sentences of that letter to the community of Jews in Marseille who sought his advice, Maimonides wrote, for is it not apparent that many statements of the Torah cannot be taken literally, but, as is clear from scientific evidence, require interpretation that will make them acceptable to rational thought? So just to be clear, for Maimonides, the arbiter of the truth of the Torah was to be found in science, was to be found in our use of reason. If science has reached certain demonstrably true conclusions about the universe, about God, as a matter of sort of philosophic logic or evidentiary truth, then that requires us to interpret the Torah in light of those philosophically astute and advanced conclusions. And he writes famously, our eyes are set in the front and not in the back. Maimonides wanted to look forward as philosophical truth and scientific advances were made. Um, we had to make ourselves acquainted with those advances in knowledge. Again, I included a source from a prior session, from whatever source, even if the source is not Jewish, from a Jewish authority. If it's true, from Maimonides, truth was always the arbiter. And you could pursue truth from whatever the source, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, because we were looking ahead in history and not necessarily behind us. One should therefore look ahead of him and not behind him. And then again, sort of poignantly sums up by saying, I have thus revealed to you with these words my whole heart. This letter, I think, really captures Maimonides' really genuine feeling that our tradition had to be understood in light of um, advances in science, in rational thinking, because for Maimonides, the Torah is truth. So we have to interpret it in a way that makes it consistent with, reconcilable with advances in scientific and philosophical knowledge. Well, I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of more texts. Maimonides received not just criticism in his own lifetime, and his followers also were taken to task. But very famously, a couple of years ago, I taught a course. This class was on Baruch Spinoza, who lived in the 17th century. And Spinoza was a great philosopher himself, but in many respects can be thought of as the first modern biblical critic. And he viewed the interpretation of the Torah, the correct way to interpret the Torah, much differently from Maimonides. He wrote in his famous theological political treatise, I will take care, as opposed to Maimonides, not to make metaphorical interpretations or to attribute anything to the prophets which they themselves did not clearly declare. Maimonides took a quite different view, for he held that every passage of Scripture admits of various and even contrary meanings, and that we cannot be certain of the true meaning of any passage unless we know that, as we interpreted, there is nothing in that passage that is not in agreement with reason or is contrary to reason. So, as I just said, rational truth becomes the arbiter of the meaning of the Torah from Maimonides. So Spinoza continues, for example, Maimonides takes the view that all instances of an apparition of an angel, so all episodes that mention an angel in the Torah, occurred in dreams, on the grounds that nobody could have seen an angel with his eyes open. But Spinoza writes, but this is mere rubbish. And Spinoza is reaching this conclusion, this criticism of Maimonides, not because he believes in physical angels, but because he disavows Maimonides' way of interpreting the Torah. He writes, Maimonidean interpreters are concerned only to extort from Scripture some Aristotelian nonsense and some fabrications of their own. And this I regard as the height of absurdity. If through Maimonidean interpretation it is permissible to pretend that the writer of the Torah meant something different, but for reasons unknown to us decided to write in that way, because Maimonides acknowledged, well, the Torah, the literal meaning is anthropomorphic in ways that we should not interpret it. This is nothing else but the utter ruination of the whole of Scripture. So Spinoza was a big believer in really accepting the pshat, the contextual meaning of the Torah, as a document of its time. We shouldn't impose, as Maimonides did, a sort of foreign conception of philosophical truth that dictates our interpretation of the Torah. Spinoza said, no, let's read the Torah as according to its own plain meaning, and not ascribe to it interpretations that rob the text of that plain meaning and that impose on it a philosophical overlay that is foreign to the Torah itself. I'll end here with this last text from a modern scholar. This is an article, Anthropomorphisms in Early Rabbinic Literature, Maimonides and Modern Scholarship. So Spinoza was criticizing Maimonides for sort of imposing a foreign overlay on biblical interpretation. in removing, for example, all the anthropomorphisms in the Torah and understanding all of them figuratively. This scholar writes, so Maimonides was not particularly effective in doing that because the Kabbalistic thought that emerged in reaction to Maimonides' philosophical endeavors really sort of doubled down on all of those anthropomorphic depictions of God in trying to plot out and map out and diagram the nature of God's realm. Again, Maimonides tried to depopulate the heavenly realm and make it simpler and remove intermediaries and really focus on the utter uniqueness of God. Kabbalah that emerged in reaction to Maimonides sort of repopulated the universe and made it filled with all sorts of what Maimonides would have considered anthropomorphic and idolatrous elements of our tradition. And those Kabbalistic notions really, in the long run, won out. But this Yair Lorberbaum is making the point, despite Maimonides sort of not winning within the arena of Jewish tradition itself, he was highly influential in the academic world. He writes, Maimonides was the foremost opponent of anthropomorphism in the Jewish tradition, who brought that opposition to its peak, giving it its most consummate and comprehensive expression. Most of his Guide to the Perplexed, along with large portions of his other writings, was devoted to developing and refining arguments and exegetical devices to be used for removing any anthropomorphism from the Bible and from Midrashic and Talmudic literature. And so he goes on to say that that modern scholars have sort of adopted Maimonidean tactics and strategies for explaining away the anthropomorphism of biblical and rabbinic Judaism. And he ends up saying, ironically, the Maimonidean radicalism of the 12th century became, in the context of modern Jewish studies, an orthodoxy in more than one sense. So Maimonides was radical in his time for trying to uproot these, what he viewed as idolatrous and heretical elements and motifs in the Jewish tradition. And he was largely unsuccessful in eradicating those elements of the tradition, but he was highly influential in the academy, in the strategies that Maimonides advanced for reading the Torah figuratively and metaphorically. And I'll just conclude by saying, to the extent that we as modern readers of the Torah, when we encounter anthropomorphic descriptions of God in the Bible, I believe most of us tend to read those figuratively and metaphorically, and not literally and anthropomorphically. And in doing so, we are Maimonideans in the way that we read the Torah, because it was through Maimonides' great influence that to the extent the Jewish tradition is sort of purified of those anthropomorphic depictions of God, that is by virtue of Maimonides' success, to that extent that he was successful in influencing us as modern readers of the Torah 800 years later. So with that, I will open it up to any questions in the last few minutes.
Mark, it's
Yeah,
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, 3 points. I don't think the first question will be answerable. I do wonder how Maimonides would think with certain modern understandings of energy and light in particular, because light has a duality in explaining how light works. It's the wave, and there's the particle without mass. So you have a phenomena that's explained two totally different approaches to get at the same entity, light.
Charlie, let me interrupt you. I can't address that issue. So why
Okay.
don't we move on
All right,
to
so
two
let's
other
go.
questions?
The second two questions, I'll give them both at once. First, how would have Maimonides have dealt, or did he deal with the I'm losing a word. Such things, the parting of the Red Sea, or the things that only God could do, the miracles.
Yeah.
How would he have dealt with that? That is unscientific. and you do need the attributes of a god to
Oh,
do that.
tell me your
And
next question quickly,
and
Joe.
the third question, the third point is, were there anybody in Maimonides' time who actually supported him, or was he a total outlier?
Okay, good question. So I'm going to have to answer quickly because the whole notion, Maimonides' approach to miracles is not uncomplicated. He did, on the one hand, I think he believed that it was possible that certain miracles were sort of built into the fabric of creation. But because he was a big believer in scientific processes, I would I think he would have to understand miracles as not God intervening at the moment to change history, because he believed that if we believe that, then we believe God is changeable and mutable, and that would defeat um, Maimonides' no conception of God. So those miracles had to comport with scientific sort of processes. They had to be allowable naturally somehow. So they were not, he didn't have a traditional view of miracles in the sense that God, intervenes at that moment in history. It's a more philosophically sophisticated notion of miracles occurring but having to comport with scientific realities. The other issue that you raise is a good one. He was greatly respected by Jewish communities throughout the world. So, and he was largely revered as a Jewish legal decisor and a legal authority through his great code, the Mishnah Torah. But on the philosophical front, he was largely sort of a lonely and dissident battler. He gained followers over time, and he certainly the sort of Maimonidean school of thought developed followers of the kind that we saw in some of these the texts. That's why there was a ban issued against them, because there were communities and schools of Jews who followed Maimonidean thought. But in his time, there were very few other very rigorously philosophically inclined thinkers like him. So he was fighting his sort of anti-mystical battle largely by himself, but he gave rise to followers after his lifetime who, you know, grew in strength and number, but faced opposition and were themselves the subject of controversy. Jerry.
That's a lovely work, Mark. I'm really enjoying this and I'm learning an enormous amount. But I'm also learning what I missed along the way. I have a couple of questions. One is, are these anthropomorphisms that we find peppering the Torah perhaps from other hands? Is there more than one writer? We've heard about uh, different hands involved in the generation of the holy books. Might some of these come from those kinds of people?
Right.
The other
So,
question, the
yeah.
other question I have is, when we use the word science here, science in the sense of knowledge, not necessarily with experimentation, but I like that point of Maimonides saying our eyes are in the front of our head, not in the back. So we should be able to understand from what we can actually see and perceive, whereas the Kabbalists almost have their eyes closed as they imagine the kinds of structures that are coming up.
Right. The first issue you raised, I'm going to give you a Maimonidean answer, Jerry. Maimonides did not believe there were multiple authors in the Torah. That's a modern approach that Maimonides in his time did not endorse. He believed that the Torah was divinely revealed. It's a sophisticated view because I think he thought it was revealed through the vehicle of Moses's prophetic perfection. Moses's prophetic brilliance helped create the Torah through his sort of interaction with the divine intellect. So it's a philosophically sophisticated conception of revelation, but it is traditional in the sense that it was essentially God in collaboration with Moses who produced the Torah. Modern critics may think that anthropomorphisms could be the work of multiple authors, but Maimonides would not have endorsed that approach. That was a later phenomenon. The second issue you raised is one that I've touched on. I'm no expert, but it is true that medieval science, the notion of medieval science, is not the same as our sense of science. But the 2 points that I've tried to highlight, two famous statements that are attributed to Maimonides: one, that we should accept the truth from whatever source, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, I think is really important and allows modern Jews who are not insular in their perspectives to become knowledgeable about other aspects of the universe and apply that knowledge to our understanding of our own tradition. So the sources of truth, it's a broad perspective from Maimonides of where we can pursue and gather and obtain that truth. And on the other hand, looking the passage that we looked at today, which you just invoked, yes, that sort of forward-looking perspective about the advances in knowledge through time, I think Maimonides, would have endorsed the fact that we know more about the universe than he did, because by simple virtue of the fact that it's 800 years later, and I think he would have encouraged us to use our knowledge and continue to look forward. But remember that from Maimonides, the Torah did embody truth. It did reflect divine revelation. The Torah is the best tool we have to facilitate moral perfection, which in turn is the prerequisite for spiritual and intellectual perfection from Maimonides. So the Torah embodies truth, and therefore, by definition, cannot be inconsistent with or irreconcilable with the advances in philosophical, logical, and scientific truth. So it can be reinterpreted over time to comport with those forward-looking advances in knowledge.
But then Kabbalah is simply a deviation to one side and not really.
Well, Kabbalah Maimonides would not have favored many of the motifs in Kabbalah.
Yeah.
I will say, on the other hand, Kabbalah, and I've said this, Kabbalah is much more sort of warm and fuzzy than Maimonides. Maimonides' brand of Judaism is not particularly, and of God, is not particularly heartwarming. Maimonides would say, well, it doesn't need to be heartwarming, it needs to be true. And that was the arbiter of what Maimonides' agenda was. For the Kabbalists, they were seeking a certain experience of a direct experience with the divine presence that Maimonides would think was simply inaccessible to us as human beings. Laura.
So how would Maimonides explain God's communication, his, prophecies, his communication with the prophets? Because he starts with Abraham and then goes to Moses. And so how would that have been factually, scientifically?
Right. So that's a good question. That question, Laura, the Maimonides' perspective on prophecy goes sort of hand in hand with his other sort of non-traditional views, as I mentioned earlier, of prayer, of reward and punishment, of divine providence in the world, meaning of God's involvement in our daily affairs. Maimonides did not have traditional views of those things. So with respect to prophecy, he had a view that the greatest of prophets, let's take in the Jewish tradition, Abraham and Moses. Moses was even at a higher stage than Abraham. But even, I believe Maimonides thought prophets could be non-Jewish, like Aristotle had reached certain prophetic heights. And by prophecy, what Maimonides meant was reaching certain levels of intellectual, speculative truth about God and the universe, in which there's sort of an overflow, and this is very Aristotelian, but an overflow of intellect between God and human beings at that height. And through that process of almost like a merger of intellect, there is prophetic communication. So it's not the traditional sort of, oh, God appears to a prophet in a dream, or not in a dream, in life, in some sort of physical manifestation. That's not Maimonides' view. Prophecy is really an intellectual enterprise. That's how communication occurs between God and human beings. So it's a totally different view of prophecy. It's a totally different view of whether God is involved in our discrete affairs. Maimonides did not think that God is intervening or supervising our daily affairs. It's in that sense a quite intellectualist view of our sort of religious experience. Any other question before we wrap up? Okay, so thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry about the technical problems at the beginning of the session. Just a reminder, our fourth and final class will be this coming Sunday evening at 7 p.m. This Sunday is the Israel Day parade, so I'm not interfering with the parade, and I hope people participate in it. And that Or Zarua has a wonderful contingent of people marching. My class will be at 7 o'clock, I think, after the parade has been completed, when everyone is back home. So I'll just note in the final session, we're going to wrap up this discussion of the sort of modern repercussions of the whole topic of biblical allegory and the whole enterprise of integrating Maimonides' enterprise of integrating Torah and reason, how that is played out in aspects of the Jewish world today, and then two other sort of thought experiments that I think I'm hoping will be interesting for everyone. One is, how has Maimonides affected the Jewish world in the 800 years since his lifetime? In what ways do we see that the Jewish world is different substantively? Because Maimonides lived 800 years ago. How is our world different Jewishly as a result of his contributions? And second and last, if Maimonides, I'm going to address this topic, if Maimonides were alive today and were writing a guide of the perplexed of our time, what topics would he be covering? What perplexities would he want to address for us in our contemporary world 800 years later? I think Maimonides would be a very useful guide for us. There's a lot to be uncertain and confused about in our own contemporary world, and I think Maimonides' thought could be a guide for us as we try to navigate it. So I'll cover those topics that try to sort of capture and summarize Maimonidean thought and try to outline the ways in which it's still quite relevant to our lives today. So thank you very much. I hope everyone.
Thank you, Mark.
Good rest of
Thank
the
you,
evening.
Mark. It was great.
Hope to
Thank
see you
you.
Sunday evening. Be well. Take care.
See you
Thank
Sunday.
you.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.